2SLGBTQ plus Career Conversations panel. So my name is Shanice. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a Career and Student Success Advisor Coordinator at Humber College. Today's event is a collaboration between the LGBTQ plus Resource Center and Advising and Career Services as a part of our National Career Month event. We're really excited to have you guys join us today. We have some really great folks joining us on the panel. And today we're just going to be talking about a conversation centered around any of the inequities and systemic barriers that 2S LGBTQ plus learners face, and to help you folks get prepared when it comes to entering the job market for a meaningful and fruitful career. We're going to be talking about lots of different experiences and insights, so I'm excited to get to know the panel today. Before we get started, I do have a couple housekeeping notes to go over. So please keep your cameras and mics off during the career conversation. There will be a portion at the end of the conversation for the audience to ask any questions. So feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A feature throughout the panel. So as questions come up, we'll be able to address those at the end. The session will be recorded. So for folks who want to look back at it, you will be able to watch it afterwards. The Q&A portion will not be recorded. If you're wanting to turn on closed captions, you'll want to click on the 3 dots at the top of your Teams panel next to the camera icon. If you click the 3 dots, there should be an option to select Turn on Live Captions, and that will turn on the live captions. And then lastly, we just want to remind folks to please be respectful of the space, others, and yourselves. So sometimes these conversations can evoke or trigger emotions or feelings of vulnerability. So please be kind to yourself and one another. And as a reminder, the session will be recorded. So if you need to take breaks and come back to the conversation, you will have the ability to watch it at a later time. So next, I'm going to pass it along to my colleague, Anna, who's going to do our land acknowledgement and speak on a few notes. So over to you, Anna. Oh, I think your mic is muted.
I'm sorry about that. There is a double sound happening here because it's being also screened in the room behind me. So I'm careful with being muted. Thank you so much, Shanice, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm very happy that we have this panel discussion today, and it sounds like an amazing conversation. We will have an amazing conversation. I'm really looking forward to attending it. I will first do the land acknowledgements and introduce myself after because I realized I didn't yet. Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty lands of Mississaugas of the Credit, known as Adobigok, the place of the Black Elders in Michisagic language. The region is uniquely situated along Humber River watershed, which historically provided an integral connection for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe, Georgian Bay regions. Now home to people of numerous nations, Adobigok continues to provide a vital source of interconnection for all. Thank you. And I'm Anna Requiashvili. Forgot to introduce myself. I am a coordinator at the LGBTQ plus Resource Center at Humber, and we're cooperating with the Career Services at Humber for this panel presentations. And as we were having a meeting before the panel started, a few of our panelists outlined that it is worth acknowledging that this is a really, really difficult week for the LGBTQ plus 2S LGBTQ plus community. Because as we are speaking about our careers or resilience in our career paths, we just got reminded by the shooting in Colorado Springs this weekend that actually physical safety and survival of many of us is at risk pretty much daily. And this week also marks the Trans Day of Remembrance, which is again another reminder annually that trans lives specifically within the community and the lives of racialized trans women are still very, very precarious around the world. I just really wanted to acknowledge this as it being a difficult week for the community. I don't really have much to say about the feelings or what this means for us. It is a very raw moment. I just hope that all of you who are here, if you're students or employees, have the kind of support in your workplaces that acknowledges the impact of the collective trauma on our lives, and that we need time and space for healing and processing. Thank you. And after this, I want to introduce our very amazing moderator, Christine. And Christine, I never asked how to pronounce your surname. Christine Shu? Can you help me?
Silent H.
Sorry.
No worries.
Thank you. And Christine currently works as a manager of education and training at the Center of Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion at Humber College. And they will take it from me from here and tell you a little bit more about themselves and their other panelists.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna, and appreciate you acknowledging that we're all entering from various places and with different relationships to this week and the various events as certainly transpired in our world. And so, hi everyone. I'm coming to you heavy-hearted, but also excited to be here to share space with folks. I am an immigrant settler, and I use gender fluid and queer women of color to describe my experiences. And also, I am somebody who lives with invisible disability as well. I'll keep my introduction quite short because really we're here today to hear from the panelists. So I will shift into introducing our panelists, the great folks that we get to share space here with today. And the first person up is Myriad Augustine. They use they, them pronouns. I'll quickly introduce, reading the bio here. They are an artist who exists at multiple intersectionalities. They are mixed Black, Caribbean, and first-generation Canadian, a trans and non-binary queer, somebody who's multiply disabled, multiply disabled, including being autistic and mobility impaired, and they are 10,000 other things that don't fit neatly into a paragraph. Because of the complexities of their identities, their work is largely focused on liminality, the crossroads, the collisions, and the questioning, and they are a firm believer in the ways that speculative fiction can allow us to envision better worlds and how to build them. They are an emerging author, having had their first short story, The Bellwoods Golem, published in the disability-centric anthology Nothing Without Us, their first YA novel, Ace of Hearts by Lorimer, about a gay teen discovering his asexuality, and have received grants from the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council to support future projects. They also designed and teach a disaster preparedness class for marginalized individuals, which has been featured in this magazine, Briar Patch magazine, and an upcoming article in Extra. So feel free to use a reaction button to welcome our panelists here. I am going to shift into introducing Jade Pichette. They use they, them pronouns. Jade Pichette is an inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility professional based in Toronto, Toronto. Currently, Jade serves as the Director of Programs at Pride at Work Canada, where they work with over 250 large employers across Canada around gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation inclusion. Previously, Jade served as the Volunteer and Community Outreach Coordinator at the Archives, the Education Programs Coordinator at Kind Space, and an independent inclusion consultant. They are an Austro-Githia priestess and interfaith advocate who was the first trans feminine person to present at the Parliament of World Religious in 2018. Jade was one of the authors of Transitioning Employers, a survey of policies and practices for trans-inclusive workplaces, and is the co-host of the Uncovering Belonging podcast. Jade has been named one of Future of Good's 2022 Young Impact Leaders, Toronto Metropolitan University's 2021 Pride Champions, and is a judge for the Canadian HR Awards. In their spare time, they can be found geeking out over queer, trans, and Norse histories, firekeeping, and spending time with their chosen family. So again, I welcome folks to use the reaction button to welcome our panelists, Jade Pichette. And lastly, we have Rani Ali, who uses they, them pronouns. Rani is a registered psychotherapist and well-being consultant at Leaves on a Stream, a consulting practice that center ethics and mindfulness in consultation and trauma-informed social programming. They're also a diversity consultant with the Equity and Inclusion Dream Team, Challenge Accepted, and an associate faculty at the Toronto Institute for Relational Psychotherapy. Rani has provided therapeutic supports to queer, trans, racialized, Indigenous, and similarly marginalized communities for 10 years. In 2020, they built a consulting practice, Leaves on a Stream, to educate others about the roots of oppression and trauma in the hope of ending long-term cycles of violence that impact the most vulnerable people in our communities. Rani is an immigrant settler, trans femme, queer person of color, living and working on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, Wyandot, Chippewas, Seneca, and Petun First Nation, which are subject of the Dish with the One Spoon, Wampum Bell Covenant. All right, so again, I will invite folks to use a reaction button. Feel free to put into the chat to welcome all of our panelists, wonderful panelists here. It's an honor to be sharing space with you folks. So at this point, I also want to do a quick mention of the share in the chat for support helplines as well, in case if folks do need to access support, please do so in the chat. And of course, there are staff on the line as well if you do feel the need to talk to folks afterwards or during the event. We'll shift now into the questions. And the first question, I will put it out to folks, the panelists here, to really elaborate more on what the wonderful bios I've described in terms of what you've done and what your current roles are about. So if folks could highlight three or provide three highlights from your career and your current role and or your work, that would be great. And as the facilitator of this panel, I will point the mic to Ronnie to get us started.
Unmute myself. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us here. Yeah, so three main points of, in my career. Let's see. It's been an interesting journey. I found myself being like the first in our community to show up in a lot of spaces, and so a lot of the programming that I was able to run when I worked in nonprofit was also often the first of its kind. There's a lot of that, the first, which is exciting to me, but also daunting because you sort of feel that an enormous weight. So one of my highlights is running a mental health support group for folks that were at the intersection of being queer and trans and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. That group was, one of the first times that I had been in a space that was exclusively folks who were QT BIPOC. And the same for a lot of the participants. And so that group was really something that started a fire in me on wanting to do more systems interventions rather than doing group work or one-to-one work as a therapist. And so that led me to consulting, and I was able to do some awesome work with some awesome folks, doing work that had not really been done before in terms of building organizational capacity for creating change and a warm and welcoming climate to folks who are different. And now I feel like I'm in the third thing that I would say is now I'm in an experimental phase with my work, doing partly stuff that feels creative, but also in different industries and kind of challenging myself to um, be more public, which comes with its own issues and challenges, which I'm sure I will talk about in the upcoming panel. And so I think, in terms of three main phases, kind of like the incubator and the kind of fire starting, the kind of spreading my wings and doing things beyond the nonprofit world and going into some very diverse industries, and now in a very experimental phase, seeing what sticks and maybe letting go what doesn't. So there we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Ronnie. Myriad, would you like to go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my bio was pretty long. I feel it felt longer every time I think I hear it read. I think if I had to pick three highlights from recent, I hate to use the word career, but recent practice, recent life. I had the opportunity earlier in the year to be on a panel and to help create curriculum and teach modules on race and gender and sexuality for Southern California Easter seals. If people aren't aware, Easter Seals does a lot of disability work, and it was a very interesting, as a multiply marginalized person who has only recently gotten a formal autism diagnosis, to teach people doing autism supports how autistic people feel about that. There was some divisive points that happened. And it was very exciting, though, because I got to really engage them in a way that they'd never been challenged on or engaged with. And a lot of people were really awesome about it. So that was really nice. There's obviously tons of more work to be done there. And I wouldn't say that I'm like the absolute best person to teach someone how to be good to autistic youth, but I think hearing someone who's autistic say things that they've heard from other autistic people is sadly uncommon in those spaces. Another thing that I've done recently, or ongoing recently, is I've been teaching my disaster preparedness class online because obviously with the pandemic, not really teaching it in person. And that's been a very interesting experience also because I suddenly went from teaching people within community in Toronto, which is a very similar sphere of people, to teaching people all over the world during an active disaster, a lot of which are like marginalized and especially vulnerable to disaster. And then there's like other disasters also happening at the same time. So I'd get people from like tiny rural Republican towns who are like the only trans person or the only like non-white person or both. And it just really emphasized to me how much we rely on these really harmful systems to connect each other, right? Like we rely on Zoom and we rely on Twitter and we rely on all of these things that are really bad for our mental health, generally speaking. But we also need them to support our mental health and support each other's mental health, and kind of like encouraged me to start developing other networks and ways for networks to thrive outside of that, which informs a lot of the work I'm doing currently in like design and communication. And then, yeah, I just recently came from a 2-week residency on Toronto Island at Artscape Gibraltar Point, which was a like 99% BIPOC artists with disabilities residency. It was the first residency I've ever been on, and also the only time that I think I've ever been immersed in like only disabled artists, right? Like only people who have all the therapist jokes, all of the like like stickers to put on your cane. Like everything was very niche, but also not niche. Like this is the world that I live in, but it was a fully realized world, and that was really beautiful. And I met really awesome people through it, and it made me way more hopeful about the future than any blog or documentary that I've encountered in the last however long my life is. I think that's it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Marianne. Kate, please.
So I want to echo, Ronnie about like having been the first in many cases, especially as a trans femme who's been out for 2 decades. It's been a bit of a journey, and I want to echo Myriad and like how we often have to create our own networks, and I know that was the case when I came out as a trans youth, and had to create a trans youth group because there was not one; they didn't exist. And also, I really want to echo this point of like the magic that like disabled, queer, trans folks create when we come together and we create community together, and the amount that we can do. And I've seen that throughout my career because I am a bit of a career queer. I've worked at 3 different, queer nonprofits over the years. And it's interesting because I'm at this point in my like career journey now where I'm, meeting with ministers, I'm meeting with, people who are in C-suite, in director roles, in very senior roles, and I, put on the corporate drag, and it is drag for the record, to do these spaces and interact in these spaces. And, earlier last year, it was mid-pandemic, really warm, no AC. But I was talking to, senior ministers in the federal government about things that our communities actually needed when it came to economics and when it came to economic justice. And I was one of 3 people in the country who was doing that, and the other 2 were also white, but they were cis folks who, frankly, have a lot more privilege than any of us that are currently on this panel. And though they've done a lot of great work, so not shouting that out, but still have had a lot of opportunities to be there, and so to be in that space was a bit of a highlight of my career, while being in no AC and like 35-degree heat and sweating, and and I really like that imperfection. I think is something that I want to talk about today, and how our career journeys are imperfect, and that is part of our journeys. I mean, another major highlight for me was how I started my career, which was starting my own company, dressing up as a frickin' fairy, and doing children's art workshops. That was my first big job, and so that also was a highlight of my career. I was in, media. I was doing the morning talk shows. Most embarrassing point of my career was the morning talk show, and really having all these different opportunities to just kind of figure out for myself what worked for me, and part of that was learning that working with kids and the arts was not my career path, and that is still a highlight for me. But I also wanted to kind of talk about, for me, a highlight was survival, and surviving the odd jobs. Things that you won't find on my LinkedIn is that I used to do house cleaning. I used to do phone interviews. I've worked retail and bad retail. Like there's good retail and then there's bad retail. Most of it maybe is on one end of it. But I've done some of those really like odd jobs that I think people don't think about when you think of careers, because those of us who are raised in poverty, sometimes we just need to find these moments where sometimes survival is a highlight. Sometimes it means that we're getting through today because it means that we can do something tomorrow. So those were kind of my 3 highlights. Is kind of where I am now is an interesting place, and I'm grateful that I can do what I can do and I can give back to community. Those first experiences of creation and co-creation that were done when I was very young, And by very young, I mean late teens. And then, surviving odd jobs and just getting through the day. Yeah, so those were the things that I wanted to mention.
Thank you so much, Jade, and thank you everyone for providing some highlights of your practice and experience and, dare I say, journey of living and surviving in the world as queer folks. Hard relate, certainly, for me. So moving into the second part here, and you folks have already touched on identity and how that comes into play with your practice of essentially even navigating I want to say navigating capitalism. And so perhaps this is more of a two-part, you can pick both and or all the options are available. The first part question here is how has your identity been important or a meaningful piece to your career development? And you folks have already touched on it, so I'll welcome elaboration and in addition to that. Or even as you folks were sharing, I was thinking, some of us, or based on what you folks have shared, you started off because of your identity and wanting to find space to relate, to connect. Perhaps how have you reclaimed that back as you, become professional queers, if you will? I'm curious about that piece. So that's the first question you can speak to, or you can also speak to perhaps navigating coming out. Jade, you talked about coming out, have been coming out for quite a while now, right? So I'll invite folks to speak to that if you'd like to talk about that coming out piece and how you've navigated that in workplace settings. So first taker, perhaps I can invite Myriad to start this time.
Sure. Yeah, to the first question, my identity informs everything that I do. I think the concept of coming out is really interesting to me because I think so often it's framed in like a very white North American, usually cis kind of sense, where it's like, this is the one secret you have. This is the one piece of your identity nobody knows, and you have to tell everyone. And the way that that's framed is also really unhelpful to a lot of people with more complex identities because it's kind of framed as a choice. Like you can come out or you cannot come out. There's so many ways in which it's impossible to fully come out and impossible to fully hide, right? As someone who's mixed black, I'm also Jewish, I'm also autistic, I'm also disabled. Like, I feel like I'm constantly in a process of coming out. Or to use different terminology, I feel like I've been masking in lots of different ways and code switching in lots of different ways. And every job has been learning how I'm bad at it. And finally getting to a point where I don't care to try and assuage anyone's feelings about who I am. So that's the first part. I think also, like, it's important to note that disclosure isn't just a one-time thing. Like, no matter how simple your identity is, if you go into a job and you're gay and you tell the person hiring you that you're gay, they're not necessarily telling anyone else, and then you meet your coworker and then you tell them that you're gay, and then you meet the first customer and you tell them that you're, like, it just goes and goes and goes and goes, which I think is what drives us to have like the most obviously queer and trans like aesthetics all the time. Like, I see that undercut and I'm like, I'm home. Like, this is good. You just don't have to use the same words again, right? Like, it just cuts out so much. Yeah, those are very abstract answers, but I'll let someone else add in.
Thanks, Myriad. And I'll toss the mic up to who would like to speak next.
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think both Ronnie and I are relating to everything that you just said, and really kind of like I've never come out at work necessarily because I've been out my entire life, and I some of my early experiences that were related to work or volunteering were like, we're queer. And so no matter what, my resume is always queer. My resume is always trans. And I've not really tried to hide those pieces of myself, though I have tried to hide some of my disabilities over time. And that is something that I've had experiences of disclosure in the workplace, but only more recently because I'm in a workplace that's actually going to support me and provide me support in any way that I need, which is a real privilege that I'm very, very grateful for, and one that I didn't expect to ever have, frankly. But yeah, for me, my career has just been my identity, and it's not that I wanted it to be. I didn't. I went into social work to be a social worker, and maybe doing direct frontline work. Like, I would constantly try to find frontline work, and consistently be told you're not the right fit, or explicitly be told that I was not being hired because I was trans, on a number of occasions. And some of this was pre the Toby's Law and Toby's Act. So even at that time, there was no way for me to even take legal recourse in those situations. One could argue there were, but there wasn't really. And even today, the legal recourse is still not exactly an ideal system. So for me, I've wound up doing this work. Like, I feel like I've constantly just arrived in queer spaces because I got my master's. I couldn't get a job. I could not get a job after I got my master's degree. Nobody wanted to hire a trans femme back then. This was like 2013 when I graduated my master's. And so I had to take my master's off my resume to get callbacks, and apply to lesser paying jobs and more junior jobs, which eventually led me to getting a job over at the archives doing queer things. Got laid off there after 3.5 years because of funding cuts, and then tried to find work, was thinking I was going to have to go into sex work full time as my mode of income, work, and then found a job here. I wasn't explicitly and only looking for queer jobs, or trans jobs, but that was what I could find. And so I'm very grateful for what I do. So I don't want anybody to take it away in that respect. I'm very grateful for what I do, and I love what I do, and I believe very strongly in what I do. But also, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for being trans, if it weren't for being queer, especially the trans piece, honestly. I feel like if I was just queer, I would and not trans, I probably would have not wound up in this work, honestly. So, yeah.
You.
I'll share some parts. So for me, I'll answer more the first question because I think the part about coming out and disclosures was handled expertly. I'm on the side of the coin where I don't have the power to choose when that happens for me. Actually, most of my coming out and my disclosures are in the midst of a very aggressive asking. So most of my coming out is most of my coming out experiences are sites of harm. But the importance of my identity is really critical to my career or my journey of jobs. As a healthcare provider who wanted to work in their own community, having a very public identity, identifying publicly, was a strategy to sort of like flying a flag, right? Of saying, I'm here now. And when I started doing this work, I was working in crisis centers and nonprofit health centers, and there were so many folks who told me that they were avoiding accessing healthcare because they didn't know whether or not there would be a provider there that would understand their experience. Now, this is me coming out of grad school and sort of doing this work without mentorship, without anybody who had gone before me to, I'm sure there were people before me, but no one who was immediately available to support me in my own growth in that work. And so I didn't consider the fact or the possibility that being so publicly identifiable would mean that I would be exposing myself to quite a lot of trauma that I did not know I had in me, but obviously found out and burnt out. And it kind of led to my career shift. I still do psychotherapy, but I do that in private practice, and I'm a lot more public than I used to be. So something interesting has happened for me in terms of identity and reclaiming identity, to get to that question. Around internally, my identities have become more and more complicated and more complex. I'm full of contradictions, and that has actually helped me find peace. But externally, my identity has had to become more and more essentialized in order to be relatable, and for people to have some kind of script that they can pull on so that they can understand how to interact with me. And so I understand now that that identity that I put out there to be understood isn't my own, it's for other people. And so being able to carve that out helped me find peace and find balance. That yes, parts of my identity is for me, and yes, parts of my identity is also to be in relation to other people. And I don't owe anyone the more complicated parts or an explanation. That's a gift that emerges when a true, genuine relationship develops. And so that's one way that I've thought about reclaiming my identity after using it as a flag for the first half of my career, and now kind of really unpacking all of the threads that constitute that flag, and being able to make certain choices that I don't think I had the privilege of making earlier in my career.
Marianne, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think Ronnie captured something really important there, where like there's the coming out for you and then there's the coming out for other people. Like there's two separate things going on. And I think every time that I've been sure that this is the identity that I want to tell people and like update myself to be, it just gets more complicated and more nuanced. Like it's fractal, right? Like you're like, yeah, I'm trans, that's it. And then I was like, maybe I'm non-binary, right? Like you know, like gender is so complicated and all these other things are so complicated that it just like leads you down this introspection, which is good. And in an ideal world, we'd be able to just, I don't know, journey in that garden of infinite combinations. But we also have to be like, oh my God, like simplify it very much so I can get hired to do the DEI thing at this bank. You know, they only know trans. Let's not complicate it with anything else. I feel like that was just like a very, very important piece to mention, Ronnie.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well, because like for a good chunk of my career, I actually publicly identified as a binary trans woman, even though I didn't privately. I've always been genderqueer. I've always been non-binary since before that was a term that was being used. We used genderqueer at the time. I still do. And yet, like, those ways that we craft ourselves, I think, is something that all equity deserving groups experience in some way or another. Like we can talk about code switching, we can talk about professional drag, we can talk about all of these things that we sometimes force ourselves into to be able to access the resources and survival. And also, just I love that point, Ronnie, of like unless somebody has created that relationship, they don't deserve those pieces of ourselves as well. So it's about like, how do you create what people deserve to see of yourself, and what is the drag that you create around the rest?
So thank you, folks, for such a great conversation so far, with such great highlights and mentions that, again, hard relate. And I really appreciate people speaking to really the boundary work that you've done to, and I can only imagine the amount of healing work that is required to be able to do that boundary work for yourself, both personally and professionally. So thank you, folks, for sharing that. We're going to shift a little bit into the next question here. And again, you folks have already touched on this. I feel like it's like the trans magic that's happening, anticipating the questions that are coming. This next question here is about navigating times of uncertainty with your career path or your journey of jobs, and perhaps the gender journey that's also associated with it as well. Yeah, the question here is to speak on that. Were there times of uncertainty in those experiences, and how did you get through those times? And I'll invite Jade if you can start first.
Sure. So yes, a lot of them. I've spent many years of my life on OW, not being able to find work and barely scratching by. Well, not even really scratching by. I really wasn't sure where I would be. I mean, just before this job, which like is the best paying and supported job I've ever had, and just supportive in general job that I've ever had. Um, I really was 1 month away from putting all my stuff into storage and like just couch hopping and trying to find a space. Like I literally was planning out how I was going to go and be like essentially houseless for a short period of time while still having access to other homes through friends, but still not having my own. And so that uncertainty is something that I don't know a single trans femme hasn't experienced if they've been out during their career. I've met ones who've come out only at the end of their career who they've been fine. But if you haven't been kind of waiting to come out in their career, I haven't met a single other trans femme who hasn't had those periods where we weren't sure where we're going to move forward. But I also think that part of that is also a natural part of your career journey of not knowing where you're going to wind up. And I think, one of the things that I wish I'd been told years ago was, you're not sure where you're going to wind up in your career. All you know is where you are right now and what can you build for yourself for future. Those are the only things that you can control. You can't control whether you're going to get that next job. You're not going to be able to control whether you're going to have certainty in the near future, but especially right now. But that being said, you know where you are right now and you can build on yourself right now. When I was on welfare, I found a program for folks on welfare to do, first aid training, to do suicide intervention training, just add things that I could add, even though I didn't know where I was going to go with it at that time. So there's been many periods, but I'd love to hear from others.
Please, Ronnie.
I'll say something. Yes, agreed. Uncertainty, big thing. I have had the privilege of having a pretty linear start to my career. So it was like, like going to university, doing a master's program, getting a job, all in the same field in psychology. And I attribute that privilege to the time in my life where I was not out. I don't think I would have been admitted to grad program and employment uh, out as a trans femme. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, after coming out, I still felt my career needed to be linear because those are the scripts we have for what your career ought to feel like. So living through like a linear career where you have one job that's 9 to 5, or in my case, 11 to 7, whatever, um, can I didn't anticipate that that would be risky. We're often told that that is how you attain job security. But what I actually found was that it was so risky because when I burnt out, I had one job and I was unable to do it. And so I went from having this sense of maybe fake stability, I lost it all. It put me in a crisis where I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to keep my apartment, and I had to move in a hurry to something more affordable. And it really upheaved my life in a way where I had to come to a hard stop. That's the thing about burnout, something in my career, like no one talks about it, but everyone experiences it. So I talk about it now. I talk about it all the time. So for me, there's some things I want to say always about burnout. You don't know you're burning out intellectually, your body knows. And so recovering from burnout is a journey into your body. So for me, I took swimming lessons. I, you know, um, I got in touch with my body. I got into bicycling. I did some sitting practice of meditation. Um, and the other thing about burnout is that it affects the people around you. And that's something that was really hard for me to stomach. Um, Especially because we don't know that it's happening. So that's a very tricky thing. Emerging from burnout, emerging from a period of uncertainty, I found that actually moving away from linear ideas and thinking like spherically, like can I work spherically? So I have like um, lots of different types of work that I engage in, so that if I'm unable to do one stream, I still have others. So it's more of like a accelerator gas pedal situation rather than, going, 100 kilometers an hour and then coming to a full stop. That type of working bred uncertainty. Um, so I have multiple streams of work that allows me to actually stomach uncertainty, and actually sometimes go toward it in a way that allows me to be creative rather than trying to survive it. End of thought.
Maria, did you want to add anything to this, or we can? Yeah, since Amanda. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry that I missed Jade's response, and I apologize if I go over any. But yeah, I really like this question because it made me think, like, I don't know that there's ever not been times of uncertainty in my journey. I feel like it's constantly been a process of not really understanding how the prescribed path is supposed to work and would work for me, and then finding out it doesn't work for me. Um, I mean, I feel like Ronnie covered a lot of what I would say about my personal experiences, but I think it's really interesting that, like, for like trans and like neurodivergent people and like marginalized people in general, we're kind of on the leading edge of capitalism's harms. And so when you think of like how we talk about like odd jobs that we've done and like precarity and stuff like that's all just, the think pieces people write about the gig economy now, and like saying like, oh, you got to work like 3-4 jobs, and it's like, yeah, we were living that 20, 30, however many years ago. And the need for like multiple income streams, like these are all things that it feels like the rest of the world wakes up to like a few years later, as capitalism gets like more and more permitted to strip things away from people. It's depressing, but it's also really interesting because it's like the flip side of us creating these new systems is that we have all of these years of experience of dealing with this terrible outcome before the rest of the world even gets to it. And I think that gives us like a lot of visioning power in how we can all have a better system.
Yeah, thank you folks for, really highlighting the frequency of which trans non-binary folks have to operate on in order to simply survive most times. And that's definitely something I sit in as well and think about thriving. And so I'm going to shift now into the next question. And Ronnie, you've already given us a head start in talking about burnout. So in recognizing the importance of self-care, the world is very tiring to exist in. Resilience is a term that gets thrown around quite a lot and has been, I would say, corporatized, if you will, and capitalized. My question here is to ask you folks of how you take care of you in midst of all of these various experiences, ongoing self journey, along with the work that you folks are up to. How do you take care of you? Myriad, would you like to get started with this one?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, okay. The caption just didn't capture whose name it was, so I wasn't sure. Yeah, I think the most important self, like, outside of all of the regular queer self-care things of like buy yourself a nice cookie, um, I think the most important part is like kind of counter propagandizing yourself, which is to say like everything around you, especially in like career advice and like corporate culture and just like capitalism in general, is like propagandizing you towards like productivity and like even specific kinds of self-care that are maybe not super helpful, and you just have to have that direct stream of like jaded, tired queer and trans people to tell you like, no, don't buy into that, like just scream into a pillow for a minute and then like think about it. Don't like feel like you have to assimilate and conform and like burn yourself out. Like you just need that person to constantly remind you that you're a human being and not a cog. I think, and that's been the most important part of not burning out, which I've done in every single job I've had until recently. Yeah.
I'll jump in real quick to kind of echo some of what you're saying, Myriad, but I have like three major points to get through here. I think for me personally, as a someone who works all the time, I work even when I'm sleeping, that I have to, I found this trick of telling myself that rest is a form of work. And all of a sudden it becomes possible. I'm like, ooh, that's appetizing. You mean to say that I need to coordinate it and plan it and maybe do an evaluation form for myself. Like if I do that, if I do work around rest, I can access it. So rest is, but it is true. Rest, like creating the setting you need for rest is a bit of a labor. The second thing that I follow in my life is that I heard this from someone else who's like the ED of an arts organization. She said that her email is a lottery system. And that means that sometimes your email gets replied to, and sometimes your email doesn't get replied to. And it depending on the lottery that day, you might get your response. I sometimes follow the rule and tell people if I can if you don't hear from me and you really need something, try me again. And kind of being able to unplug intentionally from, needing to get through every email. I don't need to. I've learned that things go on without my help sometimes. And if you found the answer before I replied, then that's wonderful. And then the third thing I would say is something that is very hard for me to say and something that's very hard for me to learn, and maybe other people can relate, and maybe other people might get upset by me saying this, but to give other people a chance to help you. I really struggled with the feeling that I needed to be the only one doing it. Otherwise, it wasn't truly earned, and gaslit myself with all these kinds of propagandas. Thank you. And I'm still learning, I'm learning it today, that I need to, people will help in their own way that doesn't match my ideal, perfect image of what helping might feel like. But that is that person offering me something maybe much more than my ideal version of help, which is their authentic presence and how they want to help. And sometimes in weird ways, accepting things that from other people has actually been the most important way that I've learned to take care of myself, is by letting other people in their own imperfect ways.
So now I feel like I need to make my own project plan for rest and present it maybe to my chosen family. But I'm going to add to that kind of last point, which is, why are we talking about self-care and not community care? And I am very much of the opinion that community care is what, as queer and trans folks, we need to have any sense of self-care. And often it's others who will see what we need, sometimes better than what we do. And, that can go in tiny ways and big ways, and I know for myself, I'm so grateful for my chosen family. I have the privilege of being able to bring in money and bring in money for my family as a whole, because both my partner and their husband are also disabled, and disabled in a way that they're not able to work. And we're all trans, and we're all queer, and we're all poly, and all these things, and neurodiverse. And the thing that I am often able to do is provide back fiscally. But that doesn't mean that I'm not getting care. I'm getting tons of care in other ways. And so it's really important that we always, I'm not even a liberal. I could go beyond that, please. But yes, no, definitely. It's the future that we want is one where we are community, right? And real community. And I have seen our communities get pushed more and more and more apart. And I think there's some political reasons for that, but I think it's also not that I get to talk about this in my role very much anymore, but it's capitalism at the end of the day is pushing us apart and apart and apart. And so it's always important that we focus on that community care, center that. Maybe we need to make a project plan for it, and then really center on that. Because that is going to have a bigger impact on your career resilience if you have that communal care than anything else. Because if your job is really, really stressful, you can step out, you can be with your family, you could be with your community, and get that care that you need that you might not be getting at work and might not never get at work. And we shouldn't expect to get all that from work, which I think is also something that has come up as a very toxic mentality of the work as family and work colleagues as family, but they're not. Even in my workplace, we're genuinely all queer and we're genuinely all like caring folks that probably would get along outside of work. We're still not a family, right? We're colleagues at the end of the day. So keep those boundaries when you can and find your community outside.
Yeah, thank you, Jade. I really appreciate, everyone's mentioning of how care can't happen in silos, right? And how important it is to have collective community care as a practice, and to be able to collectively fight against the systems, white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and so on. So thank you, folks, for sharing those insights, and just recognizing the time here. Perhaps we could now shift our conversation to the last portion, which is really providing any more tips or guidance for folks who are thinking about their careers. Any perhaps last note that you folks would like to share for today's panel? I'll just invite that up, open it up for you folks here. Any last note or tips? Please, Ronnie.
Oops, that was an accidental hand. I was just stretching. I think Myriad wants to start.
Go for it.
Hilarious. I was gonna say, like, I think capitalism encourages us to specialize and like focus. And as someone who's never been able to focus, this has always been a problem. But like, don't stop learning other things. Like, don't feel like you have to define yourself as like, I'm going into nonprofits and then I'm going to get better and better at nonprofit admin, and then I'm going to be like the best nonprofit admin. Like, I think both career wise and as like queer and trans people who deal with like precarity and burnout and stuff like that, like, just keep following weird tangents, because that might be the job that you love, or like that might be the job that lets you survive when the other job lays you off or fires you for being trans or whatever. Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to working with your elders. And in particular, I want to shout out Jamie Hamilton, who's since passed, Rupert Raj, who is still going. He's just has a quieter life outside of Takaranto now. And we didn't always have access to our elders. We didn't always have access to trans elders and knowing them and connecting with them and queer elders, because a whole generation was lost to us, and B, many didn't feel and didn't have the ability to connect with those who are younger. So I highly recommend, spend time in a mentorship relationship, connect, find somebody who is an elder, connect with the Senior Pride Network, for example, and have that and make that connection. And you'll get more advice just through talking and sharing some food and hearing some stories than you would by asking a question of most career counselors. So that's my piece.
Okay, now I'm ready. Okay, I'm going to take two very diverging approaches to answering. So on the like practical side, I would say that if you ever experience anything that you determined to be discriminatory behavior or practices in any employment setting, to document it and just have that record. It might be the hardest thing to do, but it is very important. It's very hard to go back in time to do that. And that's something that I was told, and it helped me a lot in certain situations. Doing really boring things like reading the policies, knowing your rights, is like super helpful. Knowing exactly what the organization that you're working for policy is on everything, or at least knowing where to find it is a very helpful thing to do, because so many people who are managers or senior leadership don't actually know. They go off of this is how we've always done things, even though were supposedly signing off on new policies. Anyway, and then knowing your worth and investing in yourself, and not just through like career development, but in developing all the other parts of you. That's really important. And then in terms of that, I just want to flag that the school that I work at, the Toronto Institute for Relational Psychotherapy, offers a student clinic for therapy sessions. And so the lowest rate that you can get there is $40 an hour, and the highest rate that you would pay is $60 to $70 an hour for a therapist. And so if you are interested in kind of investing in yourself, this is definitely one thing that can be very impactful. And it is, those rates, they're not, they're a fraction of what you would pay in private practice. So I just wanted to identify that, and yeah, come to more panels. Meet folks and reach out and say hi and ask questions.
Cool. Thank you folks so much for providing your insights and great practical tips. I'm seeing some engagement in the chat there as well, in terms of thinking about building our community, thinking about what type of elder you would like to be one day. That's definitely not a conversation we often end up having when we're deep in the midst of all of the work. So thank you folks so much for bringing yourself and presence into this shared space to really practice that collective community of care. So thank you.